There is a tape recording sitting in a university archive right now that was never supposed to be found. The man who made it died shortly after, and everyone who has listened to it carefully enough has had their career quietly taken apart, piece by piece, in the months that followed. David Mercer was not looking for any of this. He was a geologist, mid-career, the kind of guy who spent more time reading soil composition reports than talking to people. Methodical, a little obsessive about details, the kind of person who notices when something is misfiled, not because he is paranoid, but because he has a memory for where things belong. He was working through a box of routine polar survey recordings at a regional archive, the kind of work that sounds incredibly boring and mostly is when he found it. A reel tucked between two inventory logs from a standard coastal mapping program. No label that matched anything around it. Just a case number that did not correspond to any cataloged project he could find in the system. He almost put it back. That is the part that stays with me when I think about this story. He almost just slid it back into the box and moved on to the next one. But the case number format was slightly different from everything around it. Older looking, and David Mercer, being exactly who he is, could not let that go. He found a working reel player in a back room that smelled like dust and old rubber and the particular stale cold of a space that nobody opens very often. He threaded the tape. He put on a pair of headphones that were too tight and left marks on the sides of his head for the rest of the day. And he pressed play. The voice was calm. That is the first thing he told me about it. Not shaky, not urgent. Not the voice of someone who thought they were in danger. It was the voice of a man dictating a report, measured, professional. The kind of voice that has spent decades in briefing rooms and knows how to present information without emotional decoration. The man on the tape identified himself only by his surname and his former rank. He said he was making the recording because he had run out of other options. He said he had tried the proper channels, and the proper channels had made clear that this information was not going to move through them. He said he was not doing this out of ego or out of anger. He said he was doing it because he had seen something beneath the floor of a polar sea that no natural geological process could have produced, and because the people responsible for telling the public about such things had decided, deliberately and completely, that the public was not going to be told. Then he started describing what he had found. And David sat in that cold back room for 2 hours with headphones cutting into his skull, and he did not move once. The man on the tape was Commander Henry Ashford, and by the time David understood who that was and what his career had actually meant, the weight of what he was holding in his hands had become something close to unbearable. If any of this is landing the way it landed for me when David first told me about it, do him a favor and do yourself a favor and subscribe and leave a like. This story deserves to be heard, and that is the simplest way to make sure it travels. Henry Ashford was not the kind of man you build a conspiracy theory around. That is exactly the point. That is the thing that makes this so difficult to look away from. He was the establishment. He was the institution. He spent the better part of his adult life as one of the most respected naval geologists in government service, the kind of career that gets written up in dry institutional histories and cited in footnotes of academic papers. Not celebrated, not famous, trusted. There is a difference, and in the world Ashford moved through, trusted was worth considerably more. He came from a family with a long history of quiet public service, not flashy, not political in the visible sense, the kind of family where you showed up, you did the work, you kept your mouth shut about anything that was not your business, and you built a reputation over decades that meant something. Ashford absorbed all of that. His colleagues described him consistently, and I mean consistently across decades and across institutions, as a man with almost no tolerance for speculation. If you could not support a claim with data, he was not interested in hearing it. He was not unkind about it. He just redirected the conversation back to what could actually be demonstrated. He led multiple deep-water geological survey expeditions over the course of his career, methodical operations, well documented. The kind of work that built the baseline understanding of polar seabed formations that other researchers then built on for years afterward. He had a reputation for bringing teams home with exactly the data they went out to collect, nothing more, nothing less. His debrief reports were famously thorough and famously dull. No drama, no surprises. Which is why, when his final expedition came back weeks early and his debrief was classified within hours of its conclusion, the people who knew him did not believe the official explanation for even a moment. These were not excitable people. These were people who had worked alongside Ashford for years and knew precisely how impossible it was for that man to be involved in anything that required covering up. And yet there it was, the early return, the psychological evaluations, the classified debrief, the official statement about equipment failure and difficult conditions that not one credible weather record from the region supported. David found all of this in the days after he listened to the tape. And the more he found, the more the silence around Ashford's final months felt less like absence and more like a shape. The shape of something being held very deliberately in place. The expedition did not come home. That is the thing people miss when they read the official summary. Yes, the ship docked. Yes, the crew walked off. But anyone who saw those men in the days after their return said the same thing independently, without knowing the others had said it. They said the team that came back was not the same team that left. David spent a long time piecing together the timeline of those final weeks at sea, pulling fragments from sources that had no reason to be connected to each other. A supply coordinator who had handled the equipment manifest. A medic who had filed a report that was later heavily redacted. A junior researcher who had been on the support vessel and not on the primary survey ship, and who therefore fell slightly outside the net of whatever containment process followed the return. That last person was the most useful, not because she knew the most, but because she had not been told what she was not supposed to say. She described the primary ship coming into visual range and something feeling immediately wrong about it. Not anything she could point to in a single detail. The vessel was intact. It was moving at normal speed. But the deck was too quiet for a crew that size coming home after weeks away. No one standing at the rail. No movement visible through the bridge windows. The kind of stillness that does not belong on a working ship full of people who are relieved to be heading back. When the crew disembarked, she watched from the dock. She said they moved like people who had not slept properly in a long time. But it was not just tiredness. It was the way they were looking around, not at each other, not at the dock, not at the people waiting for them. They were looking at the sky, all of them, repeatedly, like they were checking for something. 2 team members requested psychological evaluation before they had even cleared the gangway. That is not a normal thing. That is an extraordinary thing. You do not ask for that kind of support at the moment of arrival unless something happened out there that you cannot yet put words around. Both requests were processed quietly, and both individuals were placed in a separate facility from the rest of the crew for the first several days. David could not find any follow-up documentation on either of them. Their names simply stopped appearing in any accessible record from that point forward. The official debrief was classified on the same day it concluded. The stated reason for the early return was listed as instrument failure compounded by deteriorating environmental conditions. David checked that explanation against every weather station and atmospheric monitoring record he could access for the relevant region and the relevant dates. Every single one of them showed stable conditions, not perfect conditions, not summer weather, but nothing that would have forced a team of that experience and that equipment level to cut a mission short by weeks and come home looking like they had seen something that rearranged the inside of their heads. The equipment failure explanation was the one that bothered David most specifically, because Ashford's teams did not have equipment failures. That was not a boast or a reputation built on luck. It was a documented pattern across multiple expeditions. Ashford was obsessive about preparation. The people who worked with him described pre-mission equipment checks that were almost excessive. He did not leave margins for error because he did not believe in leaving margins for error. For a mission led by that man to come back citing instrument failure as the primary cause of early return was not just unlikely. It was functionally impossible without something extraordinary having happened first. And then there were the coordinates. David found them buried in an appendix of a partially declassified logistics report, the kind of document that gets released because it looks boring and nobody expects anyone to read the appendices. The coordinates of the primary survey area. He plotted them. And what he found at those coordinates, when he started cross-referencing them against geological databases and historical exploration records, was a region that had been visited before. Not recently, not in living memory, but visited, documented, and then very deliberately removed from the accessible research records sometime in the decades prior. Someone had been to that spot before Ashford, someone had found something there, and someone had made sure the next person to go looking would not know they were walking into already broken ground. Henry Ashford published one thing after he came home. Not a full paper, not a formal report, a short contribution to a small academic journal, the kind that circulates among specialists and almost nobody else reads. He framed it carefully, the way a man frames something when he knows the words will be scrutinized. He wrote about the need to reconsider established geological timelines for polar seabed formation. He wrote that certain structural patterns observed in deep survey work were, and this was the word he chose, inconsistent with any known natural process operating within the accepted time frame of Earth's geological history. He did not say what he had seen. He did not describe the coordinates. He did not mention the expedition by name, but he used the word inconsistent 3 times in a paper that was less than 1,000 words long. For a man of Ashford's professional precision, that was not repetition, that was emphasis. That was a man pushing as hard as he could against a boundary he knew he could not cross publicly, trying to leave a mark that someone with the right background would eventually recognize. David recognized it. It took him a while, but he recognized it. And when he started tracing who else had read that paper, who had cited it, who had requested reprints through the journal's distribution system, he found something that made him sit very still at his desk for a long time. 3 separate government science offices had requested copies within weeks of publication. Not academic institutions. Not independent researchers. Government offices with names that did not advertise what they actually did. They had found the paper immediately. They had read it. And shortly after that, the journal quietly stopped being indexed in the standard academic databases where researchers would normally come across it. The paper still existed. It had not been destroyed. It had simply been made very hard to stumble across by accident, which meant someone had read Ashford's careful, measured, 3 times repeated word and understood exactly what he was pointing at. And their response was not to investigate. Their response was to make sure the pointer disappeared. The charts David found next should not exist. That is not a dramatic way of putting it. That is the only accurate way of putting it. They should not exist, and the fact that they do exist means that everything we have been told about the timeline of human exploration of that region is wrong. He found them by following the coordinates, the ones buried in the logistics appendix, the ones that pointed to a region that had been visited and then quietly removed from the accessible record. He started pulling historical navigation documents related to that area, working backwards through research libraries and private archive catalogs, the kind of slow, careful work that takes weeks and produces mostly nothing. And then a contact of his, a woman who specialized in historical cartography at a small independent research foundation, mentioned offhand that a private European collection had recently declined a purchase offer for a set of navigational charts of unusual provenance. charts that covered polar deep water corridors, charts that the collector had described in a private letter that David's contact had somehow gotten access to as deeply uncomfortable to look at for reasons he could not fully articulate. David flew to see them. He described sitting down at a wide table in a room with good northern light and white cotton gloves on his hands, and the archivist carefully unrolling the first chart in front of him, and he said the first thing he felt was cold. Not the room. The room was fine. Something else. The specific cold of understanding something before your brain has finished processing what your eyes are seeing. The charts showed the seafloor, not the surface, not the coastline, the floor, ridge formations, basin contours, the geometry of deep underwater valleys. And they matched. That is the thing. They matched the survey data from Ashford's expedition with a precision that made David's hands go still inside those white gloves. Not approximately, not in general outline, in specific measurable detail, the kind of detail that requires either direct observation or technology capable of producing it. The provenance documents placed the charts centuries before any deep-sea sonar equipment existed, before the region had even been properly named on a surface map, before any expedition on record had gotten close enough to that area to sketch a coastline, let alone map what was underneath the water. David checked the provenance 3 times. He had the documents independently assessed by 2 people he trusted. Both confirmed they were not modern fabrications. Both declined to speculate further about what that meant. There was one additional detail that David kept coming back to. In the lower margin of the most detailed chart, in a script that his cartography contact identified as a regional variant of a very old administrative hand, there were notations. Not coordinates in any modern sense, measurements, angles, depth references, and alongside them something that looked like a structural designation, the kind of notation you would use not to describe a natural feature, but to mark something that had been built, something that was placed there and needed to be distinguished from the surrounding geography on the record. David photographed everything. He thanked the archivist. He walked out into the gray afternoon light and stood on the pavement outside the building for a while before he could make himself move, because what he had just seen meant that someone had been down there before. Someone with the capability to survey the deep-sea floor of a polar corridor, someone with the organizational capacity to record what they found in a detailed and internally consistent cartographic document, and someone who had apparently found at those coordinates not just geological formations, but something worth marking as a structure. All of this at a time when, according to every history book ever printed, no civilization capable of doing any of it existed. He called me that evening. I remember the quality of his voice on the phone. Not frightened, not excited in a normal way, just very quiet and very precise, the way people get when they are trying to hold something large and fragile without dropping it. He told me about the charts, he told me about the notations, and then he said something I have been thinking about ever since. He said the charts did not feel like a discovery, they felt like a receipt. Like someone had been down there, done the work, recorded the findings, and left the record in the one kind of institution that moves slowly enough that it might survive a few centuries without being found and taken. And then David told me about what he found when he started asking who else knew those charts existed. That is when the shape of this thing got considerably darker. The research foundation that held the charts had received 2 formal inquiries about them in the years before David's visit. Both inquiries came from organizations with names that sounded academic, but that David could find no independent verification of when he tried to trace them. No publications, no conference presence, no staff listed anywhere publicly. Both inquiries had requested not to view the charts, but to acquire them. Both had been declined by the Foundation. After the second declined request, the Foundation's primary funding source had quietly withdrawn its support without explanation. The Foundation's director had written a private note about the sequence of events that David's contact shared with him. The director had not connected the two things explicitly, but she had written the note, and she had kept it, which suggests that on some level she had understood that the connection was there, even if she had not wanted to put it into words. This was not the behavior of institutions with a passing academic interest in historical cartography. This was the behavior of institutions that needed those charts somewhere they controlled, or nowhere at all. And the fact that the charts were still sitting in that archive, still available to someone with the right contacts and the right persistence, meant that so far the somewhere they controlled had not happened yet. David understood that the window for that might not stay open. He had taken his photographs, he had his documentation, but he also understood that he had now entered the same territory as Ashford, the territory of knowing something that certain very organized and very patient institutions had decided nobody was supposed to know. And unlike Ashford, he did not have decades of decorated government service to give him any kind of protection. The next question was obvious. If someone had charted those structures centuries ago, where did they come from? Who built them? And the answer to that question turned out to have been sitting in plain sight across multiple historical traditions for hundreds of years, which made the fact that nobody had connected it before either a remarkable failure of scholarship or a very successful piece of management, because it was not just the charts. Across Persian maritime records, Norse navigational texts, and a series of Chinese geographical documents that had spent decades in restricted institutional collections, there were references, careful, consistent, independently arrived at references to a civilization that had operated in deep-water polar regions and that had simply stopped appearing in the record after a certain point. Not because it was conquered, not because it declined in the way that civilizations decline. It stopped appearing the way a light stops appearing when someone turns it off, all at once, completely, with no transitional period and no successor culture that anyone could trace. David laid all of this out for me over several conversations, and I kept waiting for the part where it fell apart, where one of the sources turned out to be unreliable, or where the dates stopped lining up, or where some simpler explanation made the whole thing collapse into coincidence. That part never came. Every thread he pulled held. Every source he checked confirmed rather than contradicted the one before it. And then he told me about the historians who had documented all of this in the 19th century. Serious credentialed scholars whose work had been published and read, and then over the following decades had been systematically moved to the margins of academic discourse, not debunked, not refuted with better evidence, marginalized, cited less and less, left off reading lists, quietly classified in some cases in institutional archives where access required permissions that were difficult to obtain without a specific reason that someone else had approved. The erasure was not violent. It was patient. It looked like natural academic drift if you did not know to look for the pattern, but when you knew to look for it, it was everywhere. And it had been going on for a very long time before Ashford ever boarded a ship. Every single engineer who documented those underground structures in their original unredacted reports is dead. That is not a conspiracy. That is just time. These were reports from infrastructure projects spanning a century and a half, and the people who wrote them are long gone. But the pattern of what happened to those reports after they were filed, that is not time. That is something else entirely. David spent weeks tracking down the engineering documentation, not the published versions, not the sanitized summaries that made it into official project histories, the original field reports. The ones written by the men who were actually standing in those tunnels with lanterns or early electric lights, writing down what they were seeing in real time before anyone had told them what they were and were not supposed to notice. Most of those originals were gone, destroyed, lost, never cataloged properly in the first place. But 2 survived. 2 complete unredacted field reports from 2 completely separate projects, written decades apart, found in 2 completely separate private collections with no apparent connection to each other. David got access to both of them. And when he read them side by side, he told me the hair on his arms stood up and stayed up for the better part of an hour. The first report came from a major northern rail construction project. The engineer who wrote it described his crew breaking through into a pre-existing chamber at a depth that should have contained nothing but undisturbed rock and frozen earth. The chamber was not rough. It was not a natural cave formation that someone might mistake for construction. The walls were smooth in a way that the engineer specifically noted required either prolonged mechanical treatment or a material process he did not have a name for. The floor was level to a degree that his instruments registered as more precise than anything his own team could have produced with the equipment available to them. The chamber connected to a passage that ran deeper and further than his team was equipped to follow. He noted the dimensions. He noted the geometry. He noted that the passage showed no signs of collapse or deterioration, despite what the surrounding geology suggested was an extraordinary age. And then he filed his report and apparently waited for a response that never came in the form he expected. The second report came from a different project in a different region decades later. Different engineer, different crew, different language in the original, different everything. And yet, the description of what they found was close enough to the first report that David said, reading them together felt like reading two witnesses describing the same room from slightly different angles. Same smoothness of the walls, same precision of the floor, same connecting passages running deeper than the team could follow. And in the second report, one additional detail that the first did not contain. A notation about markings on the wall of the chamber at a specific height. Not writing in any script the engineer recognized. Not decorative in any obvious way. Geometric, precise. Repeated at regular intervals along the passage wall in a pattern that the engineer described with evident discomfort as intentional. When David overlaid the locations of both finds on a map and then overlaid those locations against the coordinates from the ancient charts, the ones that matched Ashford's survey data, the alignment was not perfect, but it was not random either. The underground structures were in the same broad corridor, the same geographic band, as if whatever had been built down there had not been built in one place, but across a connected network that stretched considerably further than any single find suggested. And then there was the question of what happened to both engineers after they filed their reports. The first one was reassigned within weeks of submission to a different project far from the original site and never returned to infrastructure survey work. The second one left his position entirely within months of filing, and there is no record of him working in any professional engineering capacity afterward. David could not find evidence of any formal pressure being applied to either man. No documented reprimand, no official investigation. They were simply redirected away from what they had found, gently and completely. The way you move a child away from something breakable without explaining why. The institutions that received those reports made their decisions quietly and quickly. The findings were not investigated, they were absorbed and stilled, and the structures those engineers had stumbled into remained exactly where they were, in the dark, under the ground, with nobody officially acknowledging they existed. Now here is where Ashford's expedition and the engineering reports and the ancient charts all lock together into something you cannot look away from. Because the structural notations on those charts, the ones in the old administrative script that David's cartography contact identified, used a measurement system that appeared in none of the known cartographic traditions of the period. David spent a long time trying to place it. And eventually, through a reference in one of the marginalized 19th century scholarly works he had been tracking, he found a match. The same measurement ratios appeared in the geometric markings that the second engineer had described on the chamber wall. The markings that the engineer had noted with evident discomfort and then apparently never spoken of publicly again. The same hand, the same system, the charts and the underground structures were not separate finds pointing in the same general direction. They were part of the same thing. Documentation and construction from a single source, separated by geography and hidden by circumstance, but coherent. A civilization that had not just existed, but had organized itself across an enormous area with enough consistency that its measurement systems showed up unchanged in a deep sea chart and in a tunnel wall thousands of kilometers apart. David called me after he made that connection, and I could hear in his voice that he had crossed some kind of internal line. Up to that point, he had been a researcher following evidence. After that point, he was something else. He was a person who understood that the thing he was looking at was real and large and had been very deliberately kept from becoming common knowledge, and that understanding changed the weight of everything he was carrying. What happened next was the part that made it impossible to keep treating this as an academic exercise. Because within 2 weeks of David making that connection and sharing it with 3 colleagues he trusted, the institutional response began. And it was not subtle. It was not the slow, patient kind of erasure that had been applied to the 19th century scholars or to the engineers who filed those reports. It was faster, more direct. The kind of response that happens when someone in a position of oversight decides that a particular line of inquiry has gotten close enough to something that the usual gentle methods are no longer sufficient. One of David's colleagues had his research access suspended by his university on grounds that were described in the official notice as administrative irregularities. Another received a visit from 2 people who identified themselves in a way that did not match any organization David could verify when he tried to trace them afterward. The third simply stopped responding to messages. Not dramatically, not suddenly. Just a gradual slowing of replies that eventually became silence, the way a signal fades when you drive out of range. David was careful. He had been careful from the beginning, but he became considerably more careful after that. He moved his copies of everything, he changed how he communicated, and he started thinking seriously about what Ashford had done at the end of his own career, when he had reached the same wall and had to decide what to do with what he knew. Ashford did not make 1 recording, he made 3. And the fact that David only found 1 of them is either the luckiest accident in this entire story or the most carefully engineered act of preservation David has ever encountered. He is still not sure which one it is. I am not sure either. David pieced the full picture of what Ashford had done in the months before his death by working backward from the tape itself. The recording had specific acoustic qualities that a sound archivist David consulted was able to analyze. The room it was recorded in, based on the reverb patterns and the ambient frequency of the background, was not a home. It was an institutional space, a library or a reading room, something with high ceilings and wooden surfaces, and the particular dead quiet of a building that takes its own silence seriously. Ashford had not made this recording at his kitchen table. He had gone somewhere deliberate, somewhere that had its own kind of permanence, and he had sat down and talked into a device with the focused calm of a man who had thought very carefully about every word before he arrived. The content of the tape, the parts David described to me over several conversations, was not dramatic in the way you might expect. Ashford did not sound frightened. He did not sound angry. He sounded like a man filing a report, which was probably the only emotional register he had ever fully trusted. He described the expedition. He described what the team found at those coordinates. He described the briefing that followed the return, the classification, the official explanations that did not match the evidence. He described his attempts to move the information through proper channels and the specific ways those attempts had been redirected without ever being directly refused. And then he described his conclusion, stated in the same measured tone he had used for everything else, that the structures his team had surveyed beneath that polar seabed were not geological formations and were not of recent origin and were not consistent with any civilization appearing in the official human historical record. He said it plainly. No hedging, no dramatic pause. Just the clean, declarative sentence of a man who had spent a career saying things he could support with data and had decided that this, finally, was the most important thing he had ever been able to support with data. David found evidence of the other two recordings through a combination of archive records and private correspondence. Ashford had distributed the 3 copies through 3 completely separate channels using intermediaries who had no knowledge of each other, timed so that each delivery happened through a different institution in a different city. The first copy went to a former colleague who had left government service and was working independently outside any institutional framework. That man died before he was able to act on what he had received, and his personal effects were handled by a family member who had no way of understanding what they were looking at. The recording almost certainly did not survive. The second copy went to a researcher connected to a private historical foundation, a different one from the foundation that held the charts, a smaller organization with less visibility. That copy was taken, not during any official process, during what the foundation's insurance records described as a break-in in which nothing of obvious value was removed. The recording was among Ashford's materials held there for review. The materials were gone when staff arrived the following morning. The foundation director filed a report. The report was processed and closed without resolution. The third copy, the one David found, had been placed inside a standard archival box alongside routine survey documentation from a completely unrelated coastal mapping program, not hidden dramatically, not locked away. Filed incorrectly. Labeled with a case number from a different project series, sitting in a box that would attract no attention from anyone who was not specifically looking for something out of place. Ashford had understood something that most people who try to protect sensitive information get wrong. The elaborate hiding places get searched. The boring ones get ignored. He had made his most important recording look like an administrative error, and it had sat undisturbed for decades in a room that smelled like dust and old rubber until David Mercer put on a pair of too tight headphones and pressed play. David told me that understanding Ashford's method was the moment the whole thing shifted for him from something he was investigating to something he was inside, because Ashford had not been trying to create a dramatic revelation. He had been trying to make sure the information outlived the system that wanted it gone. He had been thinking about decades, not months. He had been thinking about the kind of patience that institutions have and the kind of patience that truth requires if it is going to survive institutions. And David was now holding what Ashford had spent the last chapter of his life trying to protect, which meant David had to decide what Ashford had decided, not whether the information was real. That question was settled. What to do with it? The full picture that David had assembled by this point was not comfortable to sit with. I want to be honest about that because I think it is important. This was not the satisfying kind of discovery where everything clicks into place and you feel clever for having followed the thread. This was the other kind, the kind where the clicking into place makes the room feel smaller and the air feel thicker and the ordinary sounds of an ordinary day seem somehow less reliable than they did before. Here is what David had. He had a tape recording made by a decorated government scientist describing structures beneath a polar seabed that should not exist. He had ancient navigational charts, independently verified as genuine, showing those same structures in accurate detail at a time when no known civilization could have produced that survey data. He had 2 unredacted engineering reports from completely separate projects describing underground chambers with identical characteristics in the same broad geographic corridor, both reports buried after filing, both engineers quietly removed from further proximity to what they had found. He had a documented pattern of 19th century scholarship on a vanished civilization systematically moved to the margins of academic discourse without being refuted. He had a clear sequence of institutional responses to his own research, responses that clustered around the same moment he made the connection between all these pieces, responses that were too coordinated and too specific to be coincidental. And he had one more thing, something he had not told me about until the last conversation we had before he made his decision. In the margin of one of the ancient charts, not the measurement notations, a different marking entirely. Something that his cartography contact had initially passed over because it was faint and partially damaged. A small symbol, repeated twice, that when David finally had it properly enhanced and examined, looked like a schematic, a simplified diagram of something. His contact, when she saw the enhanced version, went very quiet and then said carefully that the proportions and the geometry of the diagram were consistent with a cross-section of a deep-water acoustic monitoring system, the kind of technology that human engineers had developed only in the mid-20th century, sitting in the margin of a chart that was centuries old. David made his decision the same way Ashford had made his. Not dramatically, not with a speech. He sat down and thought about what kind of hiding place the information needed and how long it needed to survive and what kind of institution moves slowly enough and openly enough that the people who want things gone cannot reach into it quietly. And then he started making copies. Not 3, more than 3. Distributed through channels that he chose for their openness rather than their secrecy. Placed where researchers with the right questions and the right persistence could eventually find them, labeled in ways that looked unremarkable to anyone not already looking for exactly this. He did not try to force the revelation. He did not go to a journalist or post everything online in one moment of exposure. He thought about the pattern of how this information had survived so far, through careful placement in plain sight, through the boringness of correct archival practice, through the patience of a man who trusted that the right person would eventually put on a pair of too tight headphones in a dusty back room and press play. He trusted that pattern. He extended it. He made himself into another link in a chain that Ashford had started, and that someone before Ashford had probably started before him. The structures are still down there. The charts are still in that archive. The tape still exists in more places now than it did before David found it. And the civilization that built those things, that surveyed those depths, that left its measurement system in a tunnel wall and a sea chart, and apparently in the margin of a navigational document as a diagram of technology that should not have existed yet, that civilization is not explained. It is not accounted for. It is sitting at the bottom of everything we think we know about human history, patient and enormous, and waiting for the official story to develop enough cracks that the light can finally get through. Here is what this whole thing means to me, having sat with it for as long as I have. The truth is not always buried. Sometimes it is just mislabeled. Sometimes it is sitting in a box in a room that smells like dust, inside an institution that moves too slowly to have noticed it yet. The people who want certain things kept quiet understand that you do not have to destroy information to control it. You just have to make sure nobody picks up the box. The only answer to that is people who pick up the box anyway. People like Ashford, people like David, people who are just irritating enough about mismatched case numbers that they end up changing everything. Now I want to ask you something directly. If you were sitting in that archive room and you found that tape, and you listened to it, and you understood what you were holding, what would you actually do? Not what sounds brave in theory. What would you actually do when you understood that the people who want it gone are patient and organized and have been doing this for a very long time? Write that answer in the comments because I genuinely want to know, and I think the people watching this alongside you do too. If this story made you think, made you question, made you feel that particular uncomfortable feeling of a floor shifting slightly under something you thought was solid, then subscribe and leave a like. It is the simplest way to make sure stories like this one keep finding the people who need to hear them.